Struggling with blood sugar levels, ready to shed those extra pounds effortlessly? Look no further. Sugar Defender, the #1 rated blood sugar formula, is here to transform your health and help you achieve your wellness goals. Click the link in the video description to get started with Sugar Defender today.
A former British Legion secretary accused of forgery over a neighbour's £5 million will has withdrawn his claim on the cash. Relatives of wealthy but vulnerable former air hostess Joan Sutcliffe had been alarmed at the sudden presence of Mark Pidsley, 70, in the twilight of her life. They were even more alarmed when after her death, a new will emerged, with Mr. Pidsley controlling vast sums of money previously destined for her stepdaughter Bridget Spencer, 68. Mr. Pidsley, a public school old boy, son of a lieutenant colonel, and stalwart of the Conservation Society of his seaside town where his garden bordered Mrs. Sutcliffe's, launched a legal bid to have the new will validated. But after Mrs. Spencer discovered two witnesses to the new will said they knew nothing about it, she fought in court. Now Mr. Pidsley has told London's High Court that he accepts the 2019 will should be declared invalid. And he has agreed a previous 2011 document, leaving the bulk of Mrs. Sutcliffe's £5 million to her stepdaughter, should be upheld. Mr. Pidsley's barrister Bree Stevens-Hoare KC denied all allegations of dishonesty, saying his client had known Mrs. Sutcliffe as a neighbour for more than 40 years. The court made no finding of dishonesty against Mr. Pidsley. Retired British Overseas Airways Corporation hostess Mrs. Sutcliffe, who died in September 2020 aged 90, owned 3 luxury homes, a large house in Putney, West London, a flat in southern France and a Victorian harbourside villa in Lymington, in the New Forest, Hants. And under a 2011 will, her estate was largely left to stepdaughter Bridget Spencer and Mrs. Spencer's 3 children, Rebecca Spencer, Victoria Turan and Harry Spencer. Much of the fortune, after all, came from Mrs. Sutcliffe's late husband John Sutcliffe, who she met when serving him in first class, when he was still married to his first wife. But the shock new will and letter of wishes, dated March 25, 2019, effectively left the lion's share to Mr. Pidsley and his son David. Aghast, Mrs. Spencer and other old friends of Mrs. Sutcliffe had only first heard of Mr. Pidsley 2 years before her death, when they learned he had driven her from Lymington to her London residence, where he then stayed as a guest. When he sought to uphold the new document, Mrs. Spencer claimed the 2019 will was a forgery and a false document which in all probability was created by the former British Legion branch officer. Mr. Pidsley and his son denied any dishonesty, maintaining the 2019 documents reflected Joan's last wishes. But the case has now been settled, with Mark and David Pidsley agreeing to a consent order which declares the 2019 will invalid, and leaves the bulk of Joan's £5 million to her stepdaughter as directed by the true will from 2011. Mrs. Spencer's barrister Faye Collinson had told the court it was not until 2 years after Mrs. Sutcliffe's death that a letter of wishes supposedly created by her belatedly emerged. It said the bulk of her fortune should go into a trust controlled by Mr. Pidsley and his son David, at their sole discretion for your benefit or given to your family as you see fit. The 2019 documents left stepdaughter Mrs. Spencer with a mere £10,000 and her children just £2,000 each and some jewellery. And as the Daily Mail revealed earlier this year, 2 acquaintances of Mr. Pidsley, Simon Parker and Marie Pollock, whose names are down as witnesses to the 2019 will, came forward to say they did not knowingly sign it. They added, in court statements, that they were later asked by Mr. Pidsley to put their signatures to a flowery letter he had written setting out a fictitious set of events involving them witnessing the disputed will in Mrs. Sutcliffe's presence over a slap-up tea at their Grade 2 listed Hampshire home. Miss Collinson told the court, in all probability, knowing Mrs. Spencer was conducting inquiries, Mark Pidsley prepared the letter in a deliberate attempt to give a false and fraudulent impression that the 2019 will was executed by Joan in the presence of Mr. Parker and Ms. Pollock. Mark Pidsley's barrister Bree Stevens-Hoare KC denied all allegations of dishonesty, saying his client had known Mrs. Sutcliffe as a neighbour for more than 40 years. The new order settling the case strips Mark Pidsley of his appointment as a personal representative of Mrs. Sutcliffe's estate. Neither party would comment last night.